Stephan Nicoleau is an investor and general partner at FullCycle, an investment company that's accelerating the deployment of climate restoring technologies by investing in the most scalable and effective low carbon solutions. Stephan also founded the Astra Project, which is a climate program office designed to catalyze transformative climate solutions across sectors in the near term. One other reason that it is such a pleasure to introduce Stephan and bring him into this Ignite webinar is that he is Project Drawdown's newly elected chair of our board of directors. It is so lovely having you here today, Stephan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction, Elizabeth. I feel very lucky to participate in all this today, and thank you all of our attendees for jumping on from all over the world. It's very, very cool to see where everyone is from. So grateful for your participation and joining us today. I'm going to share my screen very quickly here, and I will say, sometimes your reputation precedes you when you're not in the room. In that case, I will thank Elizabeth for introducing me here. As you mentioned, I'm the newly elected board chair of Project Drawdown. So very grateful to kind of just share all of our work and participate in these really exciting ways that we communicate to the world writ large. I'm the general partner at FullCycle, and I run the Astra Project. And the reason I share all this is to say I get to focus on climate and specifically methane mitigation in all of my work. I really do get to zero in on this and find opportunities to bring folks into the fold. And so today is really a discussion about what we can do as people who engage in economies, who are decision makers, who are leaders of our own right, to find the opportunities to make a business case. In this case, it's the business case of methane mitigation, right? And so it's one of those things where it's a new frame for the science that we know so well, especially because we know it so well from Project Drawdown and other leading organizations that have really elucidated methane and the levers of climate action that can be most impactful as we go about our daily lives. And here we have the opportunity to really think about the choices we can make as consumers, as leaders, as decision makers, to actually bring that into the realm of what we do on a day-to-day basis and ultimately scale the capital needed to mitigate methane. And so really excited to share some of this new thinking and framing today. And I'll say the first question we should ask, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is why should we focus on methane in the first place, right? And so we learned a lot about the methane challenge, and what we hear often, more so today than in days and years past, is that methane on a 20-year basis is 86 times worse than CO2. So pound for pound, it makes more sense to focus on methane, especially in the shorter term, than it does for CO2, all things being equal. Now, of course, in our climate emergency, we've got to do everything, but here's an opportunity for us to have outsized climate action per dollar of investment, per dollar or unit of energy. And the thing to know about methane is that since the Industrial Revolution, it has been responsible for nearly half a degree of the warming that we're experiencing. So if you think about the trajectory that we're on and how we're trying to aim towards getting back on track to a 1.5 degree world, that half a degree is material. And since the Industrial Revolution, we have about 2.5 times the amount of methane in the atmosphere than we did back then. So we know the problem is getting worse and it's accelerating and it's driving warming. And if we think about where we can start to tactically do our work to mitigate those methane emissions, a factoid that oftentimes doesn't come to the fore, but really needs to, is that methane by mass is less than 1% of our global emissions. You can see that here on the left of this table. But by warming potential, especially when you align everything to the 20-year time window to understand what's happening in the atmosphere, is over 1/3 of the warming, right? So methane in and of itself is a lever of action. And it gives us an opportunity to reframe the science to say, well, it's yes, a challenge, but it also is an opportunity. Because methane is not evenly distributed across our economy, across our operations. It's actually concentrated in a couple of geographies and 3 key sectors. And so knowing that allows us to go from a diffuse field of opportunities ahead of us to think about mitigating methane to a very focused way of thinking about where you deploy solutions and in what sectors you deploy solutions. And what's been so great about the science that we've been doing at Drawdown, the research we've been leading, and of course, the ways that we've been monitoring and evaluating and looking at methane emissions across a bevy of organizations that are now in this space is that we know exactly where the methane emissions are coming from. You can see that here on this table on the right-hand side. The majority of methane emissions come from either agriculture, energy, or waste. And in that order, you can actually see by a breakdown, not only is it just agriculture, it's primarily enteric fermentation, what happens inside the stomachs of cows and other ruminant animals. It's rice cultivation. So it's the practices that we utilize to cultivate rice, which typically grows in anaerobic conditions. And it's, of course, what we do with our waste, and not just any old waste, but specifically our biogenic waste. The way to think about that is that anything that rots creates methane. And so if we can divert waste from a landfill where it will do so, and actually make use of those molecules, we'll mitigate methane emissions from that direction as well. There's something to be said here also for the natural sources of methane. Methane does occur naturally in our ecosystems and in our biology of the planet. But the reality is our job can also be to be better stewards of land and of nearshore ecosystems and to find ways to mitigate methane emissions from our natural environment as well. Stick a pin on that because we'll talk about that later. But just understanding these components of the methane problem elucidates a lot that we can then bridge into the business case for methane mitigation. And the other beautiful piece about all of this is that, in fact, on a global basis, we know exactly where those methane emissions are coming from, not just on a country by country basis, but specifically in country. Like this map is from our friends at Climate Trace. We've done a lot to geospatially identify emissions by assets, right? Where are those energy assets that are emitting methane in abundance? Where are the landfills that are unsealed and uncapped that are emitting methane by virtue of the rotting biogenic material in those landfills? And so in looking at this map, it not only dictates where we go, but it tells us something else about the countries and the sources of methane emissions. It tells us that every country has a different thumbprint, a different fingerprint of its methane emissions. And so deploying solutions that are focused on monitoring and evaluating the methane emissions from oil and gas production in a country that is very heavily emitting methane from agriculture is a mismatch of solutions to the problem. And so this helps us to get really specific about what we apply in terms of solutions and where we apply those solutions. It also implies the kinds of policies that we should see and that we should aim to create. So for example, when we get together at the United Nations for the Conference of the Parties, COP, which you may read and hear about, a lot of times countries will mimic or replicate the policies that big country commitments get made out of the United States, China, and the EU. And so knowing what policies to replicate will help us to galvanize, incentivize, and subsidize the right solutions for the right place. And so layering this understanding creates a very clear roadmap and playbook for methane and methane action. And what I would say here is, or the question that should come up is, well, what are the solutions? The reality is, for most of the sources of methane that we see in this wheel, there are solutions that are applicable and commercializable today. You see some of them detailed here in this wheel of a graphic. And so if there's ever a case or an argument that someone's made that the solutions aren't available, you now have a little bit of knowledge to say, well, actually, there's a solution for landfill emissions in converting the gas to feedstock or composting. Or we have the ability to think about animal health and feed additives as a way to mitigate methane emissions from ruminant animals. Or we can think about getting very sharp at our detection and capabilities upstream and downstream of detecting methane from the oil and gas infrastructure. We know what solutions are available thanks to the resources like Drawdown and others, and we know exactly where to map them. And the thing about that is that it's not just knowing the solutions, it's knowing the operators, it's understanding where they fit into the value chains. And ultimately, it's understanding what is the cost of solutions. Because if you're going to make a business case, if you're going to actually figure out what is going to be the driver of economics, the first thing you've got to know is what solutions will cost. And so for a long time, there was kind of a lot of confusion and mishmash around what we should do and in what order we should do it. But in economies, you can always rely on at least one thing to be the driver of the order of operations. And that's how much things will cost. And so you can see this abatement cost curve come to the fore, and it identifies something really interesting that we should all know very well and can know together. And that's that for the majority of methane abatement technologies, they actually exist and can be implemented at negative costs. That means that they, in some way, create revenue, either because you're selling fuels or materials off into the market, or there was a cost to bearing the waste that you were dealing with, and instead you can sell it off to someone who will transform it. There's so many ways that solutions actually come to the fore in a way that's economically viable for operating businesses and for investors. And for another chunk of these solutions that you can see here in the graph, they may not be negative costs, but they can be implemented at less than $25 per ton of CO2 equivalent. The reason that matters is because right now, this very moment, there are folks buying offsets at $25 a ton or more. And so what it tells us is that the economics support the implementation of the bevy of solutions you see here. This is from our friends at McKinsey. And of course, there are solutions that are too high of a cost for now. And that tells us where we need to be putting research dollars, where subsidies and incentives can come into the equation, and where perhaps solutions need a different direction, or rather the emissions can be implemented or can be avoided by going a different direction than a very expensive solution. So by aligning the cost curve here, it tells us a lot. Now we know what to focus on. We know where to focus on it. But most importantly, what we're looking at here are the economics that can start to come together for folks who are building in a plan to implement the solutions in a way that is ordered and actually has economics that are attractive for the businesses that they're in. This is a really key piece of the equation. And we're really glad to kind of bridge all of this together with really smart folks who are thinking about it. So that gives us a good lay of the land and helps us to understand how we can start to get towards the work of implementation. That's the game here. But there's something I think we should stop over on, and that's kind of the role of capital, right? Now that we know all of this, what is the role of capital? And are we aligned in terms of the capital that is coming into climate to the sources of emissions and to the problem itself? Let's take a look. So you may have seen a version of this from prior Ignite conversations with John Foley and others, our executive director. This is kind of the way in which we ought to apply solutions based on the sources of emissions. Now, this is not methane specific. This is all emissions. So CO2, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, and of course, methane. And it tells us sectorally exactly where we should apply solutions based on the sources of those emissions. But something happens when you take a look at the beginning parts of the capital equation. So a lot of times in climate solutions, what happens is philanthropic organizations and philanthropy comes in first to de-risk those technologies. This is early stage capital that comes in and turns an idea into a pilot, or a pilot into a demonstration. It allows the technology to evolve and grow, and philanthropy plays a key role here. And what you can see is that once you start to move the capital, we wobble a little bit from this very clearly defined area or set of areas where the emissions are allocated from. We have a little bit too much philanthropy going into electricity and electricity generation. We don't have enough going into industry, meaning industrial transformation, how we actually apply solutions to that sector. And so aligning the capital is the first thing we can do to give ourselves the best shot at de-risking the right technologies that had the right costs in the right places, focused on the right emissions. And when you look into venture, it starts to get a little bit even more confused or a little bit less aligned, right? And this is my world where I talk to a number of funds all the time. And you can start to see that we are way over indexing, for example, in transportation. So the capital is misaligned because it's aligned towards where the traditional economics are, or perhaps it has not considered the economics that we just reviewed in looking at all the solutions available for methane. And so aligning the capital is the first thing we can do. And capital doesn't always look like the kinds of checks that investors might write. It also means the capital that comes from government. So 2 years ago, almost, we had the Inflation Reduction Act emerge, $370 billion of it focused on climate through incentives, subsidies, and other mechanisms for action. But you can notice here this big bar on electricity is misaligned to the 22% of emissions that come from that sector. Now, there might be some reasoning behind that, but it bears the question to ask is, could we create smarter and more intentional policy by just understanding this misalignment and reshaping and making sure we're addressing the sources of emissions with the resources necessary to allocate that capital? So this is a really important concept to understand, and this is all drawn from some really intense work at Drawdown to figure out how we actually can move the capital and align the private sector to the emissions. And if we zoom back in on methane, you start to see something else that we need to get right, which is right now we're not allocating nearly enough capital to methane in particular. So if you remember, there's 3 key sectors where methane emissions primarily are originated: agriculture, waste, and fossil fuels. And here, this is from our friends at Climate Policy Institute. You can see the darker shaded squares is what's actually being tracked as capital going towards solutions and investments and infrastructure. The more grayed out colors are where we have to go. So we have a lot of work to do. The statistic to know is that only 2% of climate finance right now is going towards methane mitigation, and that number needs to grow up considerably. And so we have so much to do here, but the reality is, because there are economics attached to it, making these economic cases in each of these sectors creates a lot of opportunity, and is also something that is more achievable than perhaps creating investment programs where there are not investable assets, projects, and companies. And so the question is, what role does the private sector play in making that business case? And so what I wanted to do here is kind of break out the private sector as we know it to corporates and to investors. Now, we could go into a number of taxonomies, but I think that's the best way to kind of bucket the different sets of actions that folks can take and that they can utilize to mitigate methane emissions. And so thinking about corporates first, there's a couple of levers of action here that we can pull on, but there's a statistic we have to know. When this came out recently from a couple of entities, Carbon Mapper and others, that nearly 80% of global emissions can be traced to just 57 private companies and state-owned companies. And most of these companies are in the business of fossil fuel extraction or large-scale agriculture. There are some in cement and other hard to decarbonize industries as well. But 57 companies being responsible for 80% of emissions should tell us exactly where we should be focusing our attention as shareholders, as bondholders, as policymakers, and as consumers. You know 57 people. There are 57 folks you can call today, right? So 57 becomes this magic number where we actually can have a lot of impact if we identify and understand not only who's making the majority of those emissions, but what they can do about it and what our role can be to create enough pressure for those folks to take action. So every corporation goes through at least an annual exercise of capital planning, right? That is to say, a CFO and their team, along with an executive team, sits in a room and says, okay, here's the capital coming into the corporation as revenue. Here's what our balance sheet looks like. And most importantly, here's our portfolio of assets that we own: a fleet of trucks, or a warehouse, or an operating business abroad. And so that capital planning is a key exercise to identify for the companies exactly what they should be doing and how they should be focused in terms of deploying capital off balance sheet and making investments for the future growth of the business. And so the first thing that companies can do is identify the key assets in their capital plan and in their portfolio. For that warehouse down the road, is it possible that we might implement a program to procure clean energy and renewables as opposed to plugging into the fossil fuel infrastructure nearby, right? And if you think about asset transformation, there's been really smart folks thinking about what that looks like at Actual and other teams, where you can start to roadmap and identify not just those assets in your portfolio, but where those assets sit in a larger infrastructure. So for example, if you have a waste intensive asset, say perhaps you're a farming operation, agricultural operation, and instead of your biogenic waste, manure and other biogenic waste sitting in a very wet pile on your land, is it possible you could divert that waste to a digester nearby, an anaerobic digester, which will break that waste down safely and convert it to fuel that can be used in the existing infrastructure? So is that a possibility? You've got to know what infrastructure exists around the corporate. So corporations can take a zoomed out view and then create a business case for what solutions get implemented in their value chain in real time. The other thing that can happen is implementing operational solutions. So for example, here we are in our assets, in our value chain, and it turns out we are procuring energy from nearby natural gas infrastructure. That creates an opportunity for perhaps a transformation to occur. Is it possible to procure that energy elsewhere and eliminate the demand signal we send to the natural gas provider that we're willing to consume that energy? Ultimately, all of these actions are part of a broader framework that we talk a lot about at the Astra Project, which is centering methane in net zero is the only way corporates will actually get there. You can see a lot of hand-wringing now in a lot of communities, especially amongst chief sustainability officers who are tasked with creating the business case internally, that getting to net zero is actually a lot harder than perhaps we thought it would be. And so again, methane as this lever of action gives us an opportunity to create the conditions for us to create the business case. And so one thing that can help in that internal function is for the sustainability function and the finance functions to be way more integrated. Only 22% of chief sustainability officers actually report up to the CEO or the CFO. And only 50% of the Fortune 500 companies even have a chief sustainability officer. So figuring out the place in the company where the sustainability function exists is an easy way for us to give that function the limelight, the power, the ability to make decarbonization a part of the overall planning for the business. It's a simple fix, but it's one that we've got to get comfortable with so that we know exactly where to put folks and what human capital needs are therefore needed for that planning to occur. I think the second is for the sustainability function to grow beyond compliance and pre-compliance. It's great that these last couple of years we've had so many frameworks emerge that help folks to decipher what they should be tracking against, what commitments can look like, and what boxes to check in terms of the actual action that takes place. But that's not enough for us to think about what an entire organization needs to do. And so decarbonization needs to thread through an entire organization. And it needs to become part of how an organization operates, not just how it complies to regulation and to frameworks. So that's a big piece of the equation. And it's something that we're now just emerging into as organizations realize this is difficult work, but it's going to require internal transformation as much as it requires external transformation. And speaking of external transformation, the value chain of a business matters a lot as well. And it can also be part of the business case that gets made. That is to say, where are we doing all of our procurement, not just energy, but the inputs into our business as we make widgets or as we provide a service. And then ultimately, what happens at the tail end of our operations? You might know that as scope 3, right? So what happens to the waste, for example, from the production of those widgets? Where does it go? And are we accountable for it? So these are questions that are really important to understand the full value chain of a business. And as you create a business case, these become key components for what it looks like for that business to truly get to net zero. And then finally, there's a cultural element to this. As much as we are all on this webinar and we wake up and think about climate issues, or at least have the curiosity, not every organization is made up of people just like us. In fact, so many of us are still learning. I learn something new every day in this sector. And so identifying how we can build belief internally, how we storytell internally, is as important as putting the solar on the roof or shutting down the warehouse down the road. It's about us believing that this is a possibility for us to do, and actually understanding the roadmap ahead by understanding solutions and how they can be implemented in the business case. A lot of words, but it's important here. Finally, where you find success in implementation, say you've done a pilot with a partner, understanding how we can templatize those models, what it took to get it done, the amount of capital that was put to work, the conditions, and the output, means that you can then share that template, not just across the business, but across the industry. So eschewing and getting rid of this mentality that we must gatekeep and trade secret everything that we do, and instead open sourcing how we got to success is going to be a critical component for competitors and companies alike to learn from each other. That's a big piece of it, because everyone's on a different part of their climate journey and understanding where they fit into the broader equation. The other thing that corporates can do is they can join coalitions that are focused on climate action. So you're not alone in making that decision or those sets of decisions. And that's a psychological thing as much as it is a learning and co-learning experience. It allows us to feel in community, that we are a community of practice solving this issue. I think a big piece of that is knowing that there are technology partners and subject matter experts and folks who are doing this day in, day out, every day, that can partner with corporates. And so understanding on a named basis, who are the folks of excellence doing this work in ag, in waste, in energy, helping corporations transform, is a key piece to the equation as well. And then I think ultimately, your large corporations have balance sheet. And what we've seen out of a number of corporates in energy and other sectors is that corporate venture programs can emerge and allow corporations to invest in companies, technology companies, the kinds of companies that we invest in at FullCycle, to understand what those companies can do for their value chain and to galvanize their development and growth. And so sometimes corporations do this in partnership together. So you might have leagues of corporates in a single sector with a venture vehicle, or they build one internally. But making investments is ultimately how we get this done. And we welcome folks to come into this space. They say in real estate, you want people to build on your block. It's kind of the same thinking there. And so we have the ability to deploy capital into solutions together. And then ultimately empowering leaders and staff and teams is a big piece of the equation. You'll remember from prior Drawdown webinars and a lot of our messaging is that every job is a climate job. And so empowering your team to play their specific role, wherever they may sit, whether it be legal or HR or marketing, gives an organization an orientation towards climate action. And that's really important to get all of this done. So that's the corporate bucket. But if we move on, ultimately, corporates are actors in our economy that bring in capital from investors. And so the question is, what role do investors play here? And as we mentioned earlier, just 2% of climate finance is allocated to methane right now. And so there's a lot more the investment community can do to zero in on the investment opportunity and galvanize action at a greater level. And so investors kind of break out into this framework here where you think about private investors. So ultra high net worth individuals, family offices, pools of capital that are not funded by public entities. And these are entities that can very simply take a look at the roadmap or the maps that we just looked at before and identify where in their portfolio they have deep methane intensity. Are we investors in large scale agricultural operations? Are we passively invested in energy assets? And what is the relationship between our capital and those associated methane emissions? Are we a principal investor in any one of those 57 companies that's responsible for 80% of the emissions? And if we are, what's our strategy? Do we divest, or do we find opportunities to talk to the board and talk to management about how they can operate better? Investors play a key role because they are the galvanizer of action and create the conditions for companies and enterprises to succeed. And ultimately, investors don't just invest in corporations and companies, they invest in funds like mine. And so identifying the highest performing and the most value aligned climate fund managers is a really great way to put climate at the center of your venture capital, private equity, infrastructure portfolios. There are so many managers now that are out there doing really excellent work that there's no reason to not have climate be a thread, if not the centerpiece of an investment program. And finally, because again, community is how we get through these things as humans, joining climate investor networks, the CREOs and tonics of the world allow investors to feel in community, to learn from each other, and to develop models where they can co-invest and mitigate risk in new ways. Fund managers, the funds that you hear about, whether it's Generation or FullCycle or Spring Lane or others, play a key role as well because we're the subject matter experts. We are out there looking at all of the companies and then selecting the ones that we believe have the highest prospects for growth and success. And so partnering with fund managers gives an opportunity to see a much broader market at hand and identify who the highest prospects and performers are or could be. I think for we fund managers, especially those who are not climate funds, identifying the methane intensity in those portfolios is really important. I think developing capital models that are fit for purpose makes a lot of sense. What does that mean? So for FullCycle, for example, we realized that it wasn't enough just to invest in venture companies. We had to invest in infrastructure assets as well. And so we put in place a model that allowed us to build infrastructure assets that are originated by our companies upon investing in the company. We solved a key problem for the company that going from a pilot demonstration of the technology to a fully commercialized plant is a really difficult road for a lot of innovators to run. And so we help them by being a capital partner through those first commercial projects. That's a way that we can be fit for purpose, galvanizing climate action and making sure that the investments are successful by virtue of a build out into the real world, doing the real climate work by building those assets. And then finally, circularity. You hear about that a lot. There's so many ways for investors who are not climate funds to build circularity and invest in circular solutions. Finding those is key because that means that we are perpetually, or at least have the opportunity to keep molecules in perpetual circulation and eliminate waste that would derive, or rather originate, methane emissions and other inefficiencies in our global systems. And then finally, institutional investors. I will say if you are not an investor or a fund manager, you might touch institutional investor land in ways that you may not consider. This is where your pension sits, or your 401k. It's where your health plan deploys capital into. And so your institutional investor community plays a big role because these are big pools of capital that can oftentimes sway the markets. And so these are institutional investors that need to understand the universe of fund managers. Who are the funds we should be deploying into? Because that's how that capital typically gets invested. What are the frameworks for institutional investors to actually understand climate as an issue and then subscribe to and commit to deploying 5, 10, 15% of capital towards climate specifically? Can these managers also price methane intensity into their portfolios of fund manager allocations and direct investments? And ultimately, what is the role that regulation plays? The IRA tells a lot of investors what capital should do and can do, what will be incentivized, what will be subsidized, what will be penalized. And so institutional investors internally can create a business case around where the capital should flow. And I think the last thing I'd say around institutions is, you see a lot of country level commitments that get made. The Global Methane Pledge, for example, a pledge that exists for countries to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. But the reality is a lot of the assets and the capital needed to do so at the country level will come from institutions, might come from state-run pension funds. And so this intersection of state-level institutional capital and methane action is complex. It's one that we can understand, and it allows us then to bring into alignment the public sector and the private sector in ways that have not yet been terribly explored before. So it's super exciting. Because ultimately, climate will take trillions of dollars for us to move the needle. And those trillions do have to come from these big pools of institutional capital. And if you are proximate to, internal at, or in some way attached to or a consumer of these institutions, as a pensioner, as someone who holds assets, you have a role to play in galvanizing their action as well. So that brings me to my last point, which is ultimately this was a couple of slides about methane, but it really wasn't just about methane. It's about the role that we all can play. And if we think about each of us having a toolkit that allows us to make the case, in this case, the business case of taking action, of mitigating methane, of implementing solutions, that is part of our individual responsibility. We all share a responsibility to face climate action, but broadening and deepening our toolkit, understanding the economics, the solutions, and the ways we can play a role in their implementation is the name of the game. And what I always say to my teams, that I'll say here, is that once you know, you can't unknow, right? This is now your broadened, deepened, and more capable toolkit that you can wield to make a business case internally at your operations and your business, wherever you operate as a human person, and find the opportunities to create the case, and in many cases, the business case for methane mitigation. So I'll stop here. What a pleasure to share some of our thinking, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to ask some questions.
Oh my gosh, everybody, let's give Stephan a virtual round of applause. Look at all those emoji claps, Stephan. Wow,
Thank you.
lots of great questions in the chat. Lots of feedback from folks. Oh wow, there's cyberspace is going nuts for you, Stephan. Oh, thank you
Thanks.
so much. Thanks for bringing your deep expertise here. We are so grateful. So we clustered a bunch of the questions in the background, and so thanks to everybody in the audience for being so thoughtful and asking such great questions. One of the themes that emerged with the audience was actually, and many of the audience members know the Project Drawdown Solutions Library really well, was actually being curious about where plant-rich diets as a solution play into the work that you're doing and into larger methane reduction efforts.
Yeah, well, they do play a key role. Obviously, we all eat food, and as that food gets produced, whether it's large scale ag that then leads to the food that we're buying at the supermarket, whether it's the meat that we consume as people that comes from the cultivation and growing of a cow, we play a role, and we are actually a demand signal for the actions that happen at the production of food. And so I know for Drawdown, we're doing a lot in food and ag this year. And so you'll look out for a lot from the organization there. But I'd say the dietary choices that we make, and we start to see this more and more, folks are taking a day or two a week, if not more, from eating meat of all kinds. That's a really easy way to diminish that demand signal, and it allows us to put a little less pressure on our food systems. And so, if we think about what that means, is that upstream, you have maybe a little less production happening that generates biogenic waste, or maybe you have fewer cows burping methane as they graze and are sometimes herded in unsanitary conditions where manure and its emissions become a factor as well. And so the food choices we make play a big role. And if you notice again in that chart, the biggest component, just by a hair, about 27-28% of methane emissions comes from ag. And so because we are operating humans, we play a key role, and our dietary choices do factor into what gets operated and put into the global economy from the agricultural sector.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephan. And I did put a link to the Global Methane Hub in the chat. I know you and I both know Marcelo and his team's great work there. And that's one of the groups that we're collaborating with at Project Drawdown, also to think about the role of methane specifically in the food system, like you said. So yeah, thanks, Stephan. Shifting a little bit to what you were talking about at the end of your talk, and this is more specific to US based folks, so apologies to our international folks for the moment, but the Department of Energy in the United States has a notice of intent to fund $1 billion in methane mitigation within the US, primarily with the existing natural gas infrastructure. I'd love to know more. I know you follow policy. You are on, international stages talking about policy related to methane. I'd love to know more about the impact that this initiative might have on right-sizing the investment landscape.
Yeah, it's an important piece. I suppose I should have put a third bucket of government making the business case, because government does play a role. Let me say a couple of things that hopefully we take in aggregate. $1 billion relative to what's needed to navigate to a low carbon transition is not enough money, but it can do a lot to galvanize the private sector if it's positioned correctly in how capital comes together writ large. The DOE is doing a lot of work through several offices, though the LPO, for example, to create the Loan Program Office, to create the conditions for projects to get up to speed more quickly and to be built and developed more quickly. I think ultimately, a couple of things matter here. One is for that $1 billion, is it galvanizing funds and investors to say, okay, there's a little bit of de-risking that's happened, so now we can bring our $50 billion, $100 billion to the same realm and same equation for us to do that work. That's the role of that $1 billion. If it's just $1 billion sprinkled into assets here or there, it's not going to have the impact that we hope it will. And so it really does have to be positioned well. I think the second piece too, yes, that's a US-centric policy that's emerging, but the key thing here is, are policymakers on a global basis learning from each other, from what works and what has been effective, so that we can replicate and scale those policies and galvanize that action on a global basis. Ultimately, yes, we're the world's second largest emitter. Historically, we are the largest emitter, but we don't necessarily have the only role to play in mitigating those emissions. And so that capital and the policy really does need to be a spark that lights up a whole field of opportunity for us to deploy much larger sums of capital.
I love thinking about the waves of capital, right? And what sparks what, right? And what needs to happen, or not, what are the waves of action when we think about deploying different flavors of capital? So thanks for your insights there, Stephan. One gathering that I know you have been very present and a leading voice at are the COPs, the convenings. You're going again this year. One of this upcoming COPs theme is actually on finance. And so one of our audience members would love to know more about the business case, the business use case for one of the 57 companies you mentioned to implement solutions aside from a regulatory environment that may or may not be enforced via the Global Methane Pledge.
Yeah, so really important that climate finance comes to the fore at this upcoming COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. So looking forward to being there to have that conversation. Obviously, I wear my finance hat more than any other. I think that ultimately, let me think about how to put this perfectly. I think ultimately, these global gatherings are getting, the COPs especially, are getting more intersectional, multidimensional. It used to just be policy wonks in a room figuring out how to hammer out an agreement between countries. And it wasn't until these last 5-6 years that the private sector really started to perk up and attend and say, well, wait a minute, there's a way we can think about playing a role here that is adjacent to and in cooperation with the country commitments. That's a big deal. And so I think ultimately, having the COP factor in climate finance is both an acknowledgement that governments can't solve everything, and it allows us an opportunity to integrate the private sector in all the ways that it is good at implementing solutions, at rolling out technology, at developing new models for capital allocation in alignment to the policies that get created at COP. It was one of my observations attending COPs these last 3 or 4 years, is that oftentimes there's a misalignment between the private sector and the public sector. And so we would make a commitment to take action, but the baton transfer, the baton handoff never happened from the commitment and the ambition to the action and the implementation. And so a lot of my work is, especially in the Astra Project, is kind of bridging that together, creating that connectivity between both sectors so that we have an opportunity to make good on these commitments. If we make good on the commitments that we have set out thus far, we should be done figuring out climate. We are well on our way. Instead, we're not, right? And so the connection between the private sector and the $200 to $250 trillion a year that gets invested into stuff, stocks, bonds, Bitcoin, whatever, and the commitments that get made in the global context needs to be more tightly integrated. And just for those 57 companies, and just coming back to the question, most of those companies are in oil and gas. And so understanding the solution set and our status quo is important here. Let me just break that down quickly, being mindful of time. So the status quo is that fossil fuels aren't going to go anywhere for a period of time. We want them to diminish as quickly as possible. We're focusing on that from a number of directions and dimensions. But the reality is it's an industry that's operating this very moment, that in many cases fueling the energy that we're utilizing to be on this webinar. And so the question is, what is that industry's most effective tool to take climate action seriously whilst we do the phase down that is very necessary? And as it turns out, for the production of fossil fuels, especially oil and gas, it is capping the wells, it's plugging the leaks, it's fixing the compressor points at pumping stations as we move natural gas around. If that industry is going to operate, at the very least, capturing its methane emissions and utilizing that methane as opposed to letting it go into the atmosphere is the most effective lever that industry can do. Those 57 companies do not need to plant trees. Someone else can do that. They don't even need to buy carbon credits. Someone else can do that. What that industry can do is plug the leaks, cap the wells, and navigate its methane footprint more intentionally, so that we are all the beneficiary of that corporate action. That's what those companies can do.
Thanks so much for clearly spelling out the roadmap and what the next steps are, especially for the folks who are in the business of emitting large amounts of greenhouse gases like methane. There's a similar question, but really focused on corporates. And I know you've worked a lot with corporate sustainability leaders and C-suite folks. And Stephan, that's a unique decision-making group of folks. What are some of the incentives that you've found that really get corporate leaders to care about methane in particular as a solution space? And our audience member mentioned that in the EU, companies have to produce sustainability reports, but as we all know, in the US, some states are actually making any ESG discussion, really challenging. So I'd love to hear about some of the incentives for corporations and where you see them moving in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these areas where, I might get in a little trouble or make it a little uncomfortable for folks who are planted in the status quo of what it means to take corporate action. The reality is that every corporation must play a role as a global citizen operator component of our global economy. And, most CSOs, most chief sustainability officers, operate a team of 4 to 10 people, right? Regardless of the size of the enterprise. So whether you're Coca-Cola or BP or some other large enterprise, you don't necessarily always have the human capital there. I think the way that CSOs and sustainability function can amass enough power within an organization. Of course, every organization has its quirks and has its idiosyncrasies, but generally speaking, the ways that CSOs can amass power is by making this business case, is by saying, here's revenue without taking any action. And here's revenue if we take that waste we were emitting or we were generating and sell it to someone who will be an off-taker for that waste, who will pay us a tipping fee, as it were. Right? And so creating the business case gives folks an opportunity to then create an economic argument that has everyone in the enterprise listening. Because ultimately, what runs corporations is a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, to stakeholders. And of course, we want corporates to consider more than just their shareholders. But by mandate, most corporates only consider their shareholders. So your shareholders want you to optimize your revenue. They want to see that you're being efficient, that you're not being wasteful, and that you're utilizing capital as a resource in the right way. And so CSOs need to become very comfortable with the finance function. I actually think there's an argument to be made that CSOs need to have a dotted line to the board to manage long-term climate risk and long-term capital planning. But ultimately, the way we move trillions of dollars, this was core to our thesis creation at FullCycle. The way you move trillions of dollars is you create an economic argument that no one can argue with in terms of creating revenue and opportunities for growth. That's how we do this. And CSOs play a critical role in how corporates tackle that piece of the equation.
Stephan, what you're making me think about is, one of the things we talk about at Project Drawdown is that climate solutions are not only just about reducing or avoiding heat trapping greenhouse gas emissions, they are often also about what we call co-benefits, right? Where they're about creating jobs, improving human health and well-being, improving a business case, right? And I think that's an interesting message for folks to take away too, is when we think about what some folks might think of as an obscure gas, but incredibly important as methane, right? How can we tell stories, like you brought up, about reducing methane and many other things, right? What are the co-benefits that are attached to reducing methane? So yeah, thanks for encouraging also folks who are kind of firmly rooted in sustainability to also root themselves in finance and in economics, right? Because being able to speak to different folks is so powerful and so critical.
Yeah, I would say that the last thing I'll add there is every person on this call makes a consumer decision every day about what we purchase, what we engage with. And increasingly, we consumers say, you know what, I'll pick this product, not that one, even though it might be 50 cents more, but I know that was created sustainably, or this company has principles that align to me and my values. And so corporations would be wise to take that into consideration as well. Your consumers are paying attention and are listening.
I love it. Well, Stephan, as we wrap up, I want folks to know that we will have more Drawdown Ignite webinars. We're so glad you were here today. We will send everything out in an email in the next week with all of the links. So don't fret if you didn't capture all the links. We'll have a link to Stephan's webinar on our YouTube that will live on in infamy. But Stephan, I want to give you the last word. What do you want folks to take away from your Ignite talk today?
Well, I mean, I hope my last point with the slide is one that sticks with everyone here. We are past the point of just being curious about climate and climate action. I would say we're even past the point of getting to the base science. We know the science really well. Now it's about action, and everybody plays a role. And so if you don't think you play a role, think again and identify in your life, in your ecosystem, in your community, in your family, what role you can play, not just for methane mitigation, but for climate action writ large, and then activate that as much as you possibly can and play your outsized role in taking as much climate action as possible. It's important.
So inspiring. Stephan, thank you for being here. You're getting lots of virtual love and gratitude. Gratitude to our audience today. Thank you for your support of Project Drawdown. We appreciate you and appreciate all of your commitments to climate solutions. I hope everyone is well and has a great rest of your week. Thank you so much, Stephan. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.